The Shepnaz podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. Yesterday, we started a discussion with the Woolerys. Brian and Julie joined us from Okinawa, Japan, and we were discussing a little bit about their background and how God worked independently in each of their lives throughout their childhood and bringing them to their faith. And then they came together at Southern Nazarene University. So shout out, you can always go to a Nazarene University, and there's always a chance that you might find the life partner that God has in mind for you. I don't think that's what we're trying to promote as Nazarenes, but hey, it is a great side benefit. So we're going to welcome back in Brian and Julie, and thank you so much for joining us again. And we really had a good discussion yesterday, and we kind of left it off as yesterday when you guys both ended up in college. You came to a realization that maybe the plans that you thought that God had for you were actually your plans, and that maybe he had something else in mind. So who would like to pick us up from there and kind of bring us back in?
Yeah, I'll start us off. So I had talked about how I had felt God call me into mission aviation. And so I really grasped on the idea of aviation. Mm-hmm. And when I let aviation become an idol, then God said, no, you need to focus on me. So I want you to walk away from airplanes. So when Julie and I started dating, I also knew that she really loved being overseas. The short-term mission trips that she had been on had been really formational. So in college, I went on a mission trip, and I was in Calcutta, India for the summer. And it was a wonderful place and incredible people, but I was sick as a dog. And it was culture shock like I had never experienced. And I thought, well, man, I'd spent a summer in Africa when I was flying, and I was unprepared to be so uncomfortable. And coming back from that trip, it really shook me. Mm. And I thought, I can't do this. Like, God, not only can I not be a pilot now, and I was okay with that, but I can't even do missions. And so all of these things that I had kind of been building my identity around, and it was all for God. God was in a process of kind of, I felt like, breaking and shaping. And so for a long time when we were dating, that was the unspoken thing, is after my experience. And I just didn't think I could do it. And, there were a lot of just pretty strong emotions with that. So you were beginning to talk about at the end when we got engaged.
So yeah, we were just gonna get married and then move somewhere else in the States for Brian to go to seminary and I could go to grad school. And we were at a friend's wedding actually a few months before ours, and saw some friends of ours from college who were a little older than us and had been volunteering in Croatia for a year. And they were telling us about their experience and their time. And they made the comment, I'm so glad we did this year of volunteer service before going to seminary, because it just gives so much more meaning to what we're learning and what we're studying in seminary. And when we were at SNU, I remember our first year, the president at that time kind of challenging the student body of tithing on the first 10 years of your life. Like if we think of life and in these ways of stewardship, what if you gave a year of your life in some kind of service? It doesn't even have to be in a different country, but just some kind of service. So that has always been in our minds. And so we really kind of started talking after that. And then we were sending out wedding invitations, and Brian had a friend who was living on the island of Guam that at the time I didn't even know where Guam was. So
it's in the Pacific Ocean.
He sent him an email saying, I know you can't come to our wedding, but we'd like to send you, an invitation like you do. I don't know if people still do that anymore, but it's what you used to do. So this friend of his wrote back and said, yes, here's our address. And then he said, I know you and Julie were always interested in missions. What would you think about moving to Guam after you get married? We were like, what? Again, I had to look it up on the internet. Where is Guam? I knew it was an island somewhere. And he said, yeah, my family's out here. We're volunteering with the Nazarene church. I've mentioned you to our pastor. He'd love to talk to you about some volunteer opportunities. So we actually started talking to this missionary pastor who was in Guam before we got married about the possibility of moving there. And he said they were looking for a couple to come for a year to work with youth and do music. They couldn't pay us anything. We'd both have to get jobs outside of the church. And looking back, I always wonder, how did our parents let us say yes to that? But they did. And so we got married, and about 6 months later, we got on an airplane to Guam, literally just with what we had in our suitcases, just our suitcases. We had nowhere to live, no jobs, no nothing, just trusting God every step of the way. And we got there, and God provided everything we needed, amazing jobs in the community that we loved. I worked as a social worker for the Salvation Army in Guam. Brian worked actually for a Japanese hotel all those years ago. We volunteered at the church with youth and children and music, and a 1-year commitment quickly turned into 3 years. And then after 3 years, Brian really wanted to go to seminary, and we loved living in Asia Pacific. And so we said, why would we go back to the States when we have a Nazarene seminary in Manila? So we ended up moving to the Philippines. And long story short, we both ended up going to seminary.
So, we got there, and we both got to start studying, but then also I got to begin working with NYI for the Asia Pacific region, which was an incredible gift to get to meet youth and young leaders from across Asia and the Pacific. And I felt that our time studying was just this massive global immersion on a campus of many different nationalities in this massive Asian megacity. And it became just this really rich experience that kept shaping us. It was interesting, though, because when we first moved to Guam, because of my experience, I was so afraid and scared that I was almost non-functional when we got to Guam. I think some people, you think when you see somebody in a job and you're like, oh yeah, it was always natural for them. And I feel like, no, it actually wasn't. It was a process of God continuing to stretch and shape us.
For sure.
So while we were there, that's where in the Philippines, is where our first son, Justin,
our son was born in the Philippines. Also, because I did not speak Tagalog when we moved to the Philippines, I couldn't really continue doing social work like I had been before. And so there were some opportunities to teach English, which I had never done before. But I started doing and found that I really, really loved teaching English. And then that's what I ended up getting a degree in from the seminary, and had a lot of different experiences there teaching adults and college students. We were only in the Philippines for 3.5 years, but that was very, very formational for us, and us as a family, especially. And then,
we always knew that when we graduated, that's an end date and there's a transition. And so we started talking to our regional leaders. Up until this point, we just had been volunteers for almost 7 years overseas, and God provided, and it was incredibly rich. It's not easy, but it was just amazing to see how he came through. And about that time, our regional director said, hey, what would you think of pastoring a church of a number of U.S. military on the island of Okinawa, Japan. And I looked at him and said, no.
No, I don't want to be paid for this. This is much too fun doing not getting paid.
Being a pastor and being a pastor around Americans was just so foreign to us at that point that I was unprepared. But, I think God chuckled. And then later on, he said, hey, Brian, are you going to ask me about this?
Yeah.
Talk to Julie. So we began praying about it, and we felt, okay, we should do this. So we went and we interviewed at the church. And in 2010, we were hired to come and pastor Keystone Nazarene Church in Okinawa, which is an English-speaking international congregation here in Okinawa.
So, and if you would speak to a little bit about, I kind of know what that reference means, but for those that don't, what's the difference between just a Nazarene church in what we would consider a foreign country as opposed to like an international Nazarene church? What is the distinction in your mind with that?
Well, we are part of the Japan district here, so that is one thing that's normal. But a not normal thing for most churches would be that our congregation changes all the time, all the time. When people come to Okinawa with the U.S. military, they are typically only here for 2 or 3 years. So sometimes they're here longer than that. Sometimes they are here shorter than that. But it is a constant rotation of people when you're talking about the military. But even also living on an island, we have a lot of other people in our church that are not with the U.S. military, but island life tends to be kind of always changing and moving. So people will move from mainland Japan down here to Okinawa, and then they might move to a different country or move back to mainland Japan. We have a number of Filipino people in our church that are here for work, but they move a lot. So we have some people that have been here the whole time we have, but it's a very small group, and everybody else is constantly changing. So it's a beautiful family with a lot of diversity represented always, but it is constantly changing. And that was a new experience for me. And we've been here almost 15 years, and it's just something I'll never get used to.
Well, it's really curious. I'm kind of, I know what it's like when maybe you've had a family in the church and they've been like really one of those helpful families and they're right there with you. And then they get a job change or something and they have to move to another area. And there's a little bit of that sense of loss, like, oh, here we go. We're going to have to try to figure out how to fill all those holes. And how do you manage that, especially in your environment where it seems to like it would be something that's happening all the time?
Yeah. It's been one of the things God's really had to teach us, because when you develop good friendships, knowing that there's an end date, you're honestly really tempted to just guard your heart and not give yourself fully. And so we've had to learn how to grieve goodbyes and also how to celebrate goodbyes. And I think one of the things that God has shown us and shown our congregation is like, man, there was a time when we never knew you, but God brought you, and that has been so special. And now you're having to move, but God wants to use you and make you a blessing where you're going. And for those of us who stay, God has somebody else that we don't know yet that he wants to bring. And for me, that's been kind of a hope-filled way of like, we don't have to cling to these relationships. God is really faithful. And so we can like lean into the transitions that come in all the different forms that they take.
I think also Another thing we've learned is that for a lot of people in the military, but for other work, for any reason, maybe they didn't plan on moving here to Okinawa, Japan. Maybe they never planned to leave their home country, wherever that is. And God really uses this time in people's lives when they are away from all their normal comforts and normal support to really draw people closer to Him. And we have seen so many people just grow deeper in their walk with the Lord while they're here, that they are different people when they leave. And we have a tradition at our church that on anyone's last Sunday, Brian asks them a few questions, and then we all gather around and pray for them. And when we had been here only a couple years, there was a young couple that had never probably left. They'd probably never thought they would leave their state, let alone their country, to live in Japan. And Brian was asking them, how has God worked in your life since you've been here? And I will never forget this. She said, before we came to Okinawa, I viewed the world as black and white. And now I see the world as full of color, and I will never be the same again. And that is just always our prayer, that God would use this time, however long people are here. Sometimes we don't meet them until their last 2 months on island. Like, it's not even like you get all 3 years with somebody, but just whatever interaction we have or they have here, that their view of God's kingdom would be expanded, of the beauty and the diversity, and that God is going before you. He's leading you. It's an exciting thing to be a part of, even with kind of the constant grief.
Sure. And I mean, I'm quite sure that, as you know, from your growing up and your background and everything, that you know that pastors have a heart to see the kingdom grow, and sometimes they want to see that manifest as their church growing, and trying to grapple with, there's a difference between the kingdom growing and a particular church growing, that you can be kingdom builders even if the numeric is not changing in your church. And if you could speak a little bit, I would imagine that's something that you've had to grapple with. What's the difference between being focused on kingdom building and making change in people's lives, as opposed to taking a look at attendance records and saying, do we have more people sitting in the church than we did last week?
Yeah, this is something I think is so natural, because human beings, no matter your vocation or profession, we want to cling on to things that we feel will give us security and validation. And a lot of those are the things that we can count, usually in money or size. And this goes across lots of professions, and even for children, money, of your toys and the size of your toys. But one of the things that Jesus never chased after crowds. And I realize what a temptation that is, to feel that, like, oh, our lives have purpose. And Jesus has been so gentle to show, as you simply start doing and practicing the teachings that I have given you, as you've learned how to start looking at people that I love and created that are around you, then not only will I deepen you, but then you're able to be used by me in ways that you can't imagine. And I think of the scripture that says He will do exceedingly more than all you can ask or think. And so many of my plans, I think, are way smaller than what God wants. But His timing and His ways are very different. So two things that God has been teaching me is, one, how to recognize when I'm counting on those false markers of success and value, and just call them for what they are. God, that's not it. You count on character and depth, and character and Christ-likeness. And then the second thing is learning how in our congregation to help people grasp the vision that your job and your life, exactly where you're at, is exactly where God's kingdom is growing and working, and he wants to use you as you're simply willing and available to be used. And I think for us, we will be shocked to see how God uses that in the ways as when we see it on this side of the other side of heaven. And so that's two ways that we've been kind of trying to really focus is God doesn't look at numbers perhaps as much as he looks at weight.
Yeah. Well, as we're kind of wrapping up our time, one of the things that we love to be able to do, obviously, we like to be able to connect with those that are in the field, but we also want to support you in prayer. So if you could speak for a moment of some of even the praises or the challenges that you have right now, that we can join you in prayer with those things.
I think a couple things always to be praying for. There's so many things we can talk about, but one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that Japan is actually the second largest unreached people group in the world. It's an amazing place to live. It's an amazing place to visit, but there are less than 2% of the entire population are Christian. And so praying for our Japanese pastors and just Japanese believers. Many of our friends that we know that are believers, their families kind of disowned them when they decided to become a follower of Jesus, when they said, I'm going to get baptized. It can be very difficult being a follower of Jesus in Japan. It is seen as countercultural. And also, like Brian was talking about, sometimes this going deep in relationship, things in Japan take a long time. Like language learning takes a really long time. We will always be learners of the language, and relationships take a really long time too, to get to a deeper level, to talk about heart issues. And so, the fact is many Japanese people don't even have a Christian friend. And so those are things to be praying about, that, the Christians that are here, that God would help those relationships with neighbors and coworkers, where they would ask questions, for the pastors, for the believers. Also, I work at the International Christian School that both our boys attend. And that's another really amazing opportunity, because it's a Christian school, but most of our students are Japanese and are not believers. And so things that we're able to talk about at school because it's Christian, it's an amazing opportunity, where most of these families will probably never enter a church building, but their children are having Bible class every day and chapels. So God gives us so many opportunities to connect. But prayers for those connections are always appreciated.
Yeah, there's 70 Nazarene churches across Japan. And praying for them and for pastors. A number of the pastors are getting very old, and retirement in Japan is very different. A pastor has a sense of like a deep love and sense of responsibility and duty. And it's not like in the States where you just like, hey, we're going to find a pastor. There aren't enough. And so there's a number of small churches where one pastor is like going between like 3 churches. And it can be easy to be discouraged, and it can be easy to kind of feel overwhelmed. So pray for the pastors in Japan, for just God's blessing on their spirits, their encouragement, on their families, on their marriages, would be an immense way of being a part of what God's doing here.
And our boys. I mentioned our boys, but that's always a prayer request. Our boys, Justin and Noah, are 16 and 14 now. Justin was born in the Philippines, and Noah was born here in Okinawa. So this is their home, the only home they've known. And Justin is just 2 years away from graduating. And so we're starting the process of what is life going to look like for him after that. But just, continued growth in their relationship with the Lord and their friends at school and in the community. We always appreciate prayers for our boys and our family.
Amen. Well, I just want you to know how much it's been a joy to be able to talk to you over these past couple episodes. And we want to leave the door open if there's any time that you say, hey, we need to talk to some people. We'll always be here to be available for you. And also, we just find it such an encouragement, as you were saying, that it's not about numbers that we're counting, but it's about the depth and the relationships. And we want to challenge you today that as you're hearing this, that you would take time out of your day to try to build a relationship with someone around you and to take that next step to help them find Jesus. We encourage you to follow everything that's going on at the church by going to shepnaz.org. Also, we encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. For Brian and Julie, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.